Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and today we're going to talk about Broadway and its love of Hollywood, and Hollywood and its hatred of Broadway. And to be really clear, when I'm talking about Broadway, I'm not talking about your Broadway. And when I'm talking about Hollywood, I'm not talking about the physical block area that is known as Hollywood. I'm actually talking about musical theater that's on Broadway, Broadway shows, and Hollywood, the industry that we call film. And I want to address three recent trends in film and theater this past year, which is um, why are so many Broadway musicals and stage plays that have done well with critics been not successful with filmgoers? Two, why are so many Broadway musicals adaptations of movies, and why are they so popular? And three, what is Disney doing that is making them more successful with film and stage adaptation? But before we get into this, Randall, what's a good way of reaching us?
Check out our website, chrisandrandall.com, and Facebook page is good, Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall.
Also, we really always want to hear what you have to say. What are we doing well? What we could do better? If you have any ideas for future shows, we'd like to hear them. The relationship between Hollywood and Broadway goes back to the very beginning of cinema. Uh, Basically, Hollywood has always looked to theater for its talent, both on stage, the writers, directors, stories. Some of our most famous movies, like Casablanca, and that started out as a play, you know, called Everybody Comes to Rick. So, there's always been a long history of this relationship between the two. But I just saw West Side Story with Steven Spielberg, which got really great reviews, and it's doing really poorly in the box office. Let's give us some background. So I don't even need to go back to the 1920s or 30s. Let's just go back 10 years. Uh, just in the last decade, we've seen things like Into the Woods, Mary Poppins Returns, Mamma Mia, here we go again, The Greatest Showman, La La Land, live action versions of Aladdin, and Beauty and the Beast do really well at the theater. Now, in fairness, Into the Woods and Mamma Mia, actually no, Into the Woods is the only Into the Woods is the only stage play on that list that started out as a stage play. But Mary Poppins Returns, Mamma Mia, Mamma Mia was also a stage play that's a sequel, but all of them feature Broadway musical theater lyricists and composers. They all feature people who have worked in musical theater. They're fairly polished works, and they've done quite well. In fact, Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin have both made over $1 billion. So it's not like historically these types of movies are bad, but somehow, as I just said, they're just somehow something. In this year alone, we've had In the Heights, which won the Tony for Best Musical of the Year when it came out. Dear Heaven, Hansen, which won the Tony for Best Musical the year it came out. And again, West Side Story, uh, Prom, uh, Tick Tick Boom, The Humans, a number of which The Humans won Best for Play of the year it came out. I saw that on Broadway. So we've had that. Then, on the other hand, on Broadway right now, or coming this season, is Mrs. Doubtfire, Waitress, Moulin Rouge, Beetlejuice, Sing Street, and again, long-running shows like Lion King and Aladdin. There's even stage plays, non-musicals, one based on Harry Potter called Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and an adaptation of Carson McCullers' To Kill a Mockingbird. Not Carson McCullers, sorry, but an adaptation of the screenplay To Kill a Mockingbird. So Broadway is doing really well with Hollywood source material, but the opposite is not the case for Hollywood's attempt to bring Broadway shows into the movie theaters.
Well, you think today is different than the last decade?
There's definitely I was reading in the Hollywood Reporter and Variety, and their argument why something like West Side Story, which has gotten nothing but sterling reviews, and is an adaptation, and not just of a Broadway musical from 1957, but a remake of an Academy Award winning film from 1961. So it has some big shoes to follow. And it pulls it off really well. Certainly, again, I think everybody who's a listener knows at least one song from West Side Story, right? You know any songs from West Side Story?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm familiar. Yes.
Tonight, Tonight, I Feel Pretty, I Like to Be in America, Sergeant Krupke, Somewhere There's a Place for Us, Be Cool, When You're a Giant. There's so many. And I'm forgetting, but everybody knows that. Did your high school do a production of West Side Story?
No, we never did.
But it's something that high schools, colleges, community theaters do. Did you see the movie ever?
You're asking the wrong person. I've never seen West Side Story.
Okay, but at least you're culturally aware of West Side
Yes,
Story,
I'm aware of
right?
it. Yes.
And the subject matter is based on Romeo and Juliet, and
Yes.
you're mildly familiar with
Yes, I'm
one,
familiar
right?
with it. Yes.
So like West Side Story. My point is, there's nothing about West Side Story. I mean this in the nicest way. That is a movie you can watch with your grandma, right?
Well, that's all the old Hollywood movies, right?
Right. So there's nothing about West Side Story that makes it, oh man, this is too hard to get. It's not an opera, folks. It's, even though it does feature composing by Leonard Bernstein, it's a very accessible thing. And when it came out in the 1950s, it was one of the most successful Broadway musicals. And when the movie came out in 1961, it was one of the most successful movies of that year. So it has really good stickability. Now, the Hollywood Reporter and Variety says that the reason why it's not doing well is the demographic of women over 40 and moviegoers 55 and up, that would be me, aren't showing up to the movie theaters because they're still afraid of getting COVID. And I'm not saying they're entirely wrong, but I find that a very simplistic approach. I think that, at some point, people do go to the movies, and I was there. And I think that's just a little bit too pat an answer. And I think there are bigger issues at hand. And I guess even if we're to accept that what they're saying, then the question becomes, well, why aren't younger people then going? Why isn't why
how does
why
Hollywood attract the audience then?
Right. Hollywood has always had a challenge, right, in getting a theater going audience, because theater going audiences are, for the most part, a little snobby, right? I mean, you go to the theater, that already puts you in the realm of some degree of, I would say contemporary theater is very middlebrow, but historically theater has been very highbrow. So Hollywood is considered slightly more lowbrow and middlebrow, and often people don't want to see, like we did, our very first episode was about Cats, right? And how bad Cats was.
Well, I defended it, if you recall.
You did, actually. You liked, actually, remind me again, did you like the movie?
I saw like a film version of the stage production, and I also watched the movie, and I didn't see much of a difference. I mean, I think the movie captured the play well, and so
Right.
I think the people that didn't like the movie just weren't familiar with Cats. That was my opinion.
Okay.
It's just
so
Cats, the movie.
I
It
I
really
think
is.
one of the things that Hollywood does to attract a theater going audience will be to often get actors that we know have consent, or they give the film a look that looks somewhat more like a stage performance. I think maybe, in fairness, I actually thought that Cats, the movie, was pretty well cast. I think that they did cast it with people who could sing and who had theater experience. But I think something as simple as just the CGI really turned people off on the movie, wouldn't you say?
Well, I mean, a lot of people made jokes about it, but I didn't think there was anything really wrong with it.
Right. I'm not saying Cats is bad. I'm just saying sometimes it's just the simple as the look not being right.
I mean,
So-
the Cats movie. It was definitely aimed at children. It was definitely aimed at like all ages, and I think that the that the lowbrow playfulness, the childlike humor, it probably did turn off a lot of adults. But I mean, it wasn't meant. I don't think it was meant to be. I mean,
Right. So you don't.
Cats. I mean, some of the theories behind why Cats was such a popular musical was that it was good for people that didn't even speak English. You could go watch Cats, not speaking English, and really enjoy it.
Right. But you
It's
saw the live. You saw the stage production, right?
well,
So you could see.
just a recorded version. Yes.
Right, but you could see aesthetically how different the two were.
I didn't think they were that different. I mean, I
I
honestly
mean, the
think they
costumes
did
are
a
very
great
different.
job. I
I,
honestly think they did a great job of capturing
okay.
the stage performance. Yeah.
Well, I would say, as someone who's more of a theater goer, that I think the big disconnect there was that it didn't have any semblance visually to what was being adapted, which is, so I think that often when Hollywood is trying to attract a theater going audience, they will try to find some elements from the stage production, whether it's in casting or the way they shoot it, that reminds you, like, oh yeah, there's really good dancing. Like you certainly, I liked the trailer for West Side Story, and I think we did a thing on the trailer for West Side Story. But even if you've seen the trailer for, say, Chicago, it becomes very clear normally when it's something exciting that there's a style that you will see choreography, you will see music. For In the Heights, they just literally did a number as their trailer. They just
So
showed.
so how do you think Hollywood tries to get the the theater goers into see the movie? Like what it?
So those are the ways it does it. As it, Hollywood goes after the theater going audience by giving them something that links it to a theatrical production. There's almost a promise that you are going to see a stage production on film.
And
All the things that you liked about the stage production will now be brought to the screen. And
right?
that's a great dream. And if they can offer something that looks like a good dance number, if they can do what they did, show a whole number. Now, in fairness, it didn't work for In the Heights, and it didn't work for West Side
Well,
Story.
here's a question: what is the theater going audience going to get out of the movie if they went to the theater and they like the dancing and singing and all that? I mean, what's the movie going to do differently? It's
Well,
not going
I
to do
think
anything differently, right?
I think what they're gonna get, and I think Into the Woods did a very good job of this. Is Into the Woods cast some people, not a lot of people, but some people like James Gordon or Meryl Streep or Anna Kendrick, who, even though we know them from film, we also know they're good singers. We know they're good actors, and we know that you put them in something, and you're gonna get a good theatrical, almost stage-like time.
So
So I
star
think a
power.
lot. Two things. I think getting actors who we buy as people we want to see in musical theater. I think casting is important. And I think Frank Marshall had success with Chicago. He understands how to give a sense of musical theater within a cinematic way that doesn't turn off theater goers. Now, I guess the opposite is, how does Hollywood attract non-theater going audience to its adaptation? And I think you're right. I think star power is the way to go. So, for example, they just announced they're doing a production of Wicked for film, and the original production was Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth, and I cannot remember both of the women for it, but I know that they cast Ariana Grande in as the witch, which is a
Well,
key
West
part.
Side Story definitely didn't have huge star power, right? I mean, who?
Well, it didn't. It had Anson Elgort, who's really good looking. But it had Rita Moreno for the theater people, and that was a big draw because she was in the original film version of West Side
Well,
Story.
instantly, according to your analysis, West Side Story's got problems. So,
West Side Story has problems, but
so
it
what?
doesn't mean that they weren't trying to think it through. You know what I'm
So
saying? Steven Spielberg is certainly someone savvy enough to think about his casting. I think he got Ansel Elgort. Look, the great thing he did with his casting is he actually had Hispanics play Hispanics, unlike the 1961 version. But
yeah, but
in
we're talking about the context of
about
trying to
how
get
does
people into the theater. So, like,
right. So how does Hollywood get non-theater people to go? Is by casting people like pop singers like Ariana Grande, or in the case of Cats, Taylor Swift.
oh, is Taylor Swift in West Side Story?
No, Taylor Swift was in Cats.
Oh, she was. Oh, I
Yeah,
forgot.
and Ariana Grande will be in Wicked. Uh, you could argue that Angel Elfort was there as for the movie going audience to go see because he's a young matinee idol, and that might be why they got him.
Well,
Uh,
do you think the tastes of young people and old people are different when it comes to these musicals?
yeah, I do think so. And let me be really clear: Hollywood would consider a young film goer to be someone 25 and under, and theater considers anyone under 50 to be a young theater goer. So right off the bat, culturally speaking, you are dealing with very a different definition of what it means to be young. And you know, I will say that if you look at the stuff that has done well on Broadway, I'll get to that a little bit later, and you look at what has done well at the cinema for young people, it has been very much about pop music, right? Like these are not quote unquote what I would call, well, so the most popular movie musicals these days, right, are the biopics,
Okay, yeah, sure.
the life of. Then you have films like a La La Land, and they're very popular, or what was a Pitch Perfect. So you have these movies that young people like to see, where for the most part, the actors are just playing real people and in very identifiable situations, not a lot of high conceptness, really easy to identify. And they're singing songs, even if they're written by musical theater people, they're done in a very pop way, and I think, that's they're heavy on the score. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like people really like the songs. The stories are, for the most part, very generic, right? I mean, most of these movies are about a group of people who are singers who have a dream, who want to make it big. Even Sing, I just saw the trailer for Sing 2. It's no different, right? It's a bunch of non-professionals who dream about hitting it big as singers. Period. End of story, right? And then
It's a
they get
little
their big break.
simplistic, but yeah, it seems to work
Then
for
they
the
get
audience.
right. And the
You know,
biopic,
modern audiences don't like things that are complicated,
right.
honestly.
And the biopic is, and we'll do a whole show on it because we've watched like 30 of them. The biopic is the rise and fall and redemption, and it features songs you've already heard before, just done again. And you're like, oh man, I can't wait to hear "We Will Rock You," or
Well,
I can't wait to hear "I Walk the Line" because you know the song.
people
So
like that.
young people, for the most part, want to be catered to. They want music they've already heard before. They want situations they can relate to. They love pop singers being cast as variations of themselves because, as you pointed out, there's a certain degree of
Parasocial
parasocial.
identification there, yeah.
Yeah. So even though I don't know how Ariana Grande is the Wicked Witch of the West, but I get it. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, when she's singing about heartbreak and misery, you can still think of, oh, here's a woman who used to date Pete Davidson.
Do
And
you think okay, so let's
older people, let me answer. Okay, I was going to talk about older people, but
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Talk about older people.
the older people are different, right? Older people, and I'm really talking about me because I'm 55 and up. You're technically young by musical theater. We grew up as when I was a kid growing up in the 70s. We would get bused to see Broadway musicals. My parents would take me, my mom would take me to see Broadway musicals. Did your mom make sure you got a certain degree of exposure to musical theater?
Not really. I grew up like a normal American, Chris.
Did you ever see a
No
play?
theater.
None.
When I was a kid, our elementary school took us to see Beauty and the Beast on stage. This is pre-Disney, though.
Okay,
I don't think there was any singing.
but it's fun. They took you to the theater though.
Yes.
And did your mom take you to some theater stuff?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, your mom's a librarian. I'm so surprised.
Well,
Uh,
I grew up out in the middle of nowhere, so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And that's the other thing too is that we're rural people, non-rural people, but anyway, older people. We don't need things as literal. We often we'll see musicals of things that we've watched when we were younger in revival, or we'll see new works by people who were familiar with either lyricist composers or musical theater people we've seen before. I think older people also are not as big fans of pop music, so they tend to like the melodic lines of musical theater, which is very different than pop music. And also musicals tend to be long, so older people have the patience. And often musicals tend to be take place in the past for some reason, and older people love things that take place in the past.
Well, we've talked about the general aesthetics of the theater versus the stage versus the cinema before, right?
Yeah,
It's the I think the word you used before was indicative. The was that the word you used? The theater is
yeah,
indicative, and
indicative. It's indicative. It doesn't really show you the whole world. It just shows you a piece, and then you have to imagine the rest.
right, and the cinema is more like candid photography where things are literal.
Yes.
And so it is interesting that I think that the best, I mean, I haven't seen Spielberg's West Side Story, but I think that some of the best musical adaptations for the cinema are literal
Well,
because they're using the language of cinema.
you raise an excellent point, and I want to get into that actually. Yeah, I mean we can get into that now if you want to. Yeah, let's do
Well,
that.
just briefly
So,
tell me what you're thinking.
well, I mean, there's a lot of different things going on here, and I, I will say, and I just watched a really wonderful piece on why the movie The Producers, the 2005 musical, didn't do well, and raised a lot of questions that I'm just going to straight up crib from. So, one of the problems that you really see is that theater is designed for a live audience. So, everything in the theater is big enough to reach the person in the worst seat. That means the costumes, the set designing, and even the performing is big. And once you put a camera and you can do all sorts of camera work in the theater in the movie, you don't need to do that. So often what you see happening in adaptations is they don't really understand how to translate a theatrical experience into a cinematic experience. So if you bring in actors from the Broadway production, they might be playing it too big because they're so used to doing it that way, or the costumes are too theatrical, or they use sound stages, as you say, when they could actually use real locations because it's film. There's a lot that you give up. Sometimes also, and I'll take a slight deviation because I didn't want to talk about straight plays or stage plays. In the adaptations of that, a play I saw by John Patrick Shanley in Westwood only 5 years ago did come out on TV, came out this year. It was not very good, but often when you see translations like The Humans, which won the Tony for Best Play of the Year, and I saw that, or Tick Tick Boom, which I saw the original one mentioned, often what happens there is one of two problems. Either the playwright, when they adapted it into film, didn't open up the world, and it still is a play that takes, it's very claustrophobic, and it takes place in one space, or they have added so many things to the story that was not in the film that it just becomes its own beast, right? So in the theater, whether it's a musical or a straight play, the things are slower. You know what I'm saying? In a musical, you don't sing until your emotions are so great that you have to sing. And in a straight play, it's kind of the same deal. You're always working your emotions to get to that big moment where you either say something that's amazing or you do something that's amazing. But the emotions are always a slow burn, picking up speed. You don't need to do that in film. In film, you first off, you don't need to have all the exclamation points. And two, you can move a lot faster. So a lot of times what happens when you're watching a play that's been adapted into a film is it's the pacing just seems painfully slow, and the camera can get so much more across.
Well,
And
let's
that's true
move.
whether it's a film, whether it's a musical or not a musical play.
Well, let's move on. What do you think are the bigger social implications of these successful plays and musicals failing when they're adapted?
Well, this is really fascinating because, as I just said, up until COVID, we were doing okay, which is why I also thinking it's too bad an answer that old people aren't showing up and young people don't like musicals. Uh, I know I sent you a thing. There's a number of more musicals that are going to be coming out in the next couple of years. I wonder how many of those might be cut back due to the current trending, but I think there's a couple things. First off, a lot of the musicals that have come out have been depressed, and a lot of the more popular musicals are upbeat. And I think that given the times we're in, we're kind of like in the 1930s when the Busby Berkeley musicals came out. So one of the great implications I think is that we're probably going to see more upbeat musicals being made into movies and less issue oriented musicals, which is more contemporary musical theater being made into movies. So I would suspect what you're going to see is things that are, and we'll get into this in a minute, but there's been a lot of movies that were made in, like Hairspray is a good example, right? Hairspray was a movie made into a musical, then made into a movie based on the musical. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of the Broadway musicals that were made out of movies made into films that are cheery and upbeat. And I think we're going to get away from both plays and musicals that deal with social relevance for a couple of years until society is happier again.
Well, why do you think Broadway is adapting movies from the last 30 years into musicals?
One of the things, again, is they're trying to draw in younger people. And by young, I mean people 50 and under. And Broadway is very expensive, more expensive now than ever. It's a very conservative. And historically speaking, ever since its inception, it has always adapted novels, films, and other works into musicals, into plays. It likes having secondary, it likes having something that was successful in a different platform before they made the Broadway show, because they know that they can at least draw in fans of the original source material. Even The King and I, believe it or not, was based on a novel, So often is the case now more so than ever. I think they look, if a theater ticket is going to run you anywhere from $50 to $500, and a night of theater is never a cheap experience, you're really looking at somebody who is, for the most part, in their 30s and 40s, and has some good money. And one of the ways you get them is to pick something from their youth that they can relate to, that they liked back in the day, and draw them in and say, hey, what if we took Legally Blonde and we made it into a musical? What if we took Beetlejuice? Remember Beetlejuice? Well, let's make it into a musical. And I think I think it's safer. Also, movies that were made in that period from the 80s to the early 2000s, and I mean this in the best way, a lot of them are very innocuous, right? I mean, there's nothing really dangerous about the Addams Family Values. There's nothing inherently dangerous about Beetlejuice or Mrs. Doubtfire. I mean, they're the kinds of movies that are family fun. And I know this from working in a theater. One of the biggest ways to make money is to have a musical where mom and dad can take their kids.
How do you think does the theater treat their adaptations different than the cinema treats their adaptations from the theater?
Absolutely. And I think this is maybe why theaters had greater success than cinema, because it's much easier to take something that's small and make it big than take something that's very big and make it small. And I think what theater does whenever it takes an old movie is it looks for ways of heightening the emotions. It looks for ways of making the characters have more inner turmoil, stronger emotional needs, more emotional wants. It'll just up the personal stakes because it can't afford to do a big action sequence. Because in a movie there might be a great chase sequence or there might be a great visual. It can do quite a lot visually, don't get me wrong. But the key is that you're really working more to the character's emotional catharsis. So they are very unreverential about the original source material. They will cut scenes, they will cut intentions, they will make whatever changes they deem necessary with no reverence for the source material. In some senses, you could argue there's a certain thing that theater considers itself superior to film. So why should it be reverential for the material at all? I saw West Side. I saw one of my favorite films, but is Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, and I saw Andrew Lloyd Webber's adaptation of it, directed by Trevor Nunn, and it is very close to the film, but not identical. But it doesn't need to be. You know what I'm saying? It figured out what is the emotional through line of these two characters, what really matters, and then it builds around that. So that now cinema is the opposite. I will say cinema, as I've said before, is very reverential of theater most of the time. So it tries to keep in so much of the theatrical elements from the stage production that sometimes, as it says, it gets in the way of the language of cinema.
Well, how does Broadway attract a movie audience?
Star casting.
Okay.
They will get names they will get Hugh Jackman, and who's a great musical theater actor, don't get me wrong, but they'll cast him in Music Man. They are doing a production of Plaza Suite by Neil Simon, and who did they get? Matthew Broderick and Sarah Jessica Parker, who have done a lot of theater, don't get me wrong, but they're famous. I remember, and every so often they'll get someone like a Julia Roberts to, a big movie star, and just put him on. Or, as I said, they'll take a movie, or they'll do, what they call a jukebox musical, like Jersey Boys or Mamma Mia, where they will just take pop songs and build a musical around that.
All right. I think you already talked about this, but speaking of non-musicals, dramas, what are the challenges of adapting dramatic films into dramatic stage plays?
Well, you're right. I did say into it, and there's certainly, like this year, I cannot remember the actual name of the John Patrick Shanley play I saw, but it was just about a man and woman in Ireland who live on abutting property lines who fall in love with each other. And there's a little bit of a backstory about their family's mutual history and discontent. When John Patrick Shanley, an Academy Award-winning screenwriter of Moonstruck and a Tony Award-winning screenwriter for Doubt, made the film, he added in all these crazy backstories and complications and characters, and he just got so far from what the original play was as to be almost a completely different movie, and it bombed. There's a play called The Humans that won the Tony. I forgot the name of the writer, but he did the adaptation. It's available on Showtime. We'll get into that in a minute. And the reviews have been pretty solid. And I think it was pretty solid because, and it's very insular. But, it's casted. Now, he went with stunt casting. He got people like Amy Schumer and what's the guy's name from Walking Dead? Yoon?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I forget.
Even you.
Okay.
From Walking Dead, and Benny Feldstein and Richard Jenkins, but they're all really good actors. So I think he found a way of getting actors who in this part, but even that won't do very well. So I would say, in answer to your question, I think someone like Aaron Sorkin, who did the adaptation of Network, who did the adaptation of A Few Good Men onto Broadway, whose own play, A Few Good Men, has done very well. I think people like him and Peter Morton, who did Frost Nixon and the Queen into that, I think what they do very well is they understand that the camera versus the audience really dictates how you tell a story. And that, much like I just said beforehand, you really have to think about less is more, because the camera does tell more. You need less dialogue, and you need more visual elements. And I think you have to kind of, if you're a playwright who can't think in pictures, if you're a playwright who can't think in cinematic terms, and I went to school for playwriting, and the way they teach us is to really think of an audience on a stage. You really need to change the way you look at the world. And if you can't, then you need to work with a director who understands both and can help you with that.
Well, when you're writing a play, you're thinking of. I mean, you're thinking of the scene, right? Is that what you're saying? You're thinking of
Well,
how
when
to
you're
make the
writing a
scene work.
play, you're thinking of a stage, and when you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking of a stage, you're thinking of the limitations of a stage, and if you're thinking about the limitations of a stage, just have camera. A friend of mine once said the difference between a romance on stage and a film is the close-up. You know, if a man sees a woman and he falls in love with her on stage, they both have to use their body, their voice, the tonality, all these different things to have the people in the audience realize they're falling in love. But you do that same scene in a movie, and all you need is a close up of the man's eyes and a close up of the woman's eyes. You play some music and you get it much faster.
You need more dialogue, right? On stage, you need to explain a lot of things with dialogue.
Exactly. You
Okay.
need to explain a lot of things in dialogue, or if not, then you need to have the body fully visible. There are just things that you need to do because it's an audience, and the further they are from, they can't see your face. They may not be able to hear you very well. So you just have to make things bigger, stronger, and give yourself more time. And you
Yeah.
have to understand. And you went to school for film, so you understand. And we've had this discussions in our previous creative collaborations that there are just so many things a camera can do in a matter of seconds that take minutes in a script.
Do you think there are bigger social implications of Broadway's Hollywood obsession?
Yes, and this is a very disconcerting one. And actually, I'm a bit more worried about this. So, back at the beginning of the century, a guy named Robert Lopez wrote a satirical spoof of Sesame Street called
Oh,
Avenue Q.
Avenue Q.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes, yes. I haven't seen it, but I've listened to the album.
It's great, right? Very funny,
Yes, it's very good.
very subversive. And then he worked with the guys from South Park on Book of Mormon. Also, very funny, very subversive, very original. And then as his career, he's a lyricist. He ended up working on some TV shows, and then he eventually works for Disney. And he did the work. He did Frozen with his now wife, who's also a lyricist. And I would argue the opposite of Avenue Q is Frozen. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that, if you are a composer today, I feel like in Broadway they're more risk adverse. They're less likely to do things that are offensive. They're less likely to want to deal with issues. And if you're subversive and funny and you've got something cool and interesting to say, I think you'll give it up for a good paycheck.
It's interesting because his career follows a certain pattern that I've seen with outsiders who make it into the industry.
Yeah.
They do a work that shows that they're smarter than everything else in the industry. Like they do a work that makes fun of everything in the industry. I'm better than you. I'm smarter than you. Everything you make is crap. I mean, even the South Park guys to a certain extent did that. And then because of that work, they get a normal industry job, and then they just do the same stuff they used to make fun of. and, and you see that pattern a lot.
It's no mistake that Robert Lopez's career really finally puts him at Disney. Because I really want to talk about how Disney is its own beast. The House of Mouse.
Yeah, so what does Disney do differently with these things?
Okay, and then as I said, look, long-running, successful Broadway play, Lion King and Aladdin. The only two movie musicals to ever make $1 billion plus are Lion King and Aladdin. The Beauty and the Beast comes close. And years ago, when I first came to town, I had a guy named Chris Vogler as a teacher, and he had been a vice president at one of the many Disney sub companies, and he worked with Jeffrey Katzenberg. And the original deal Disney had back in the late '80s with Aladdin and with Lion King, all this, is they would get people who were composer lyricists from London's West End and from Broadway, and they would make a deal with them. They would do a really proper musical theater book lyrics, like Beauty and the Beast. And Disney would have the right to do whatever the heck they wanted with it. But in turn, Disney, and then this is when Disney started buying theaters on Broadway and the West End, they would guarantee them a 6 month run, either in London or on Broadway or both, of their musical the way they wanted. And that started to attract a level of talent that you had never seen. Because before, look, not knocking the Sherman Brothers were Disney's in house talent from the early 60s to the 70s. And they were the ones who did great music. But once the Sherman Brothers left, you look at the musicals of Disney from the 80s on or late 70s, it's very hit or miss. So to get people who were schooled in Broadway theater and to write musicals. I remember when I saw the movie Beauty and the Beast in 1990. Was it came out in 90 or 91?
I don't know.
I was so struck by how it followed a traditional musical theater structure versus a cinematic structure, and how much you relied on musical theater talent, and that really got them started. So, because they're willing to basically split the difference, and again, they have a platform like no one else. I mean, you're there. Anything they do, they can get to you by toys, amusement parks. Aladdin, before it was a Broadway musical, was a actual 1 hour show you could watch at Disneyland, and I used to see it all the time. So Disney understands how to test things, market things, and it's interesting too because Disney Plus is a very like. I don't know if you know this, but Disney Plus has Hamilton.
Right. Well, what
I'm,
role do you think these streaming and cable companies play in this
right.
process
So
of
Disney was
musicals?
smart enough to kind of figure out something, which is, wouldn't you have expected Hamilton to have been a movie?
Well, eventually, right?
No. What Disney did was they filmed a staged production of it and they just put it on Disney Plus. And I know people, by the way, who loved it so much on Disney Plus that they, when they flew to New York, they bought those incredibly expensive tickets and saw it live. They understand that if you show a really good taped live performance of a musical, it will sell tickets to the actual production of the musical, which is not always the case when you see a crappy film version of a musical that you can eventually catch on Broadway. Now, you saw Cats taped, right? And what was your take on that?
It came out in the '80s, I believe, and I
Yeah,
thought it was great. I mean, it sounds great. It looks pretty good. I mean, yeah. I mean, it was. I had no problem with it. I don't know why you don't see more of that.
right. And that's what you're seeing now with streaming services and the cable services is that HBO, I know, hired Spike Lee to record America Utopia, which is the David Byrne Broadway play where they play music he did with the Talking Heads as a soloist. And it's more. I'm not even doing it justice, but I watched the Spike Lee version of it, and Spike Lee's version of it isn't that different than Jonathan Demme's Stop Making Sense. It's just a well done live performance, filmed in a very cinematic way that, much like Cats, gives you that feeling you got with Cats. Uh, but even if it's not a live performance like Hamilton or American Utopia, you can look at something like Tick Tick Boom, which Lin Manuel Miranda worked on this piece that was originally done by Jonathan Larson, who did Rent. And it got great reviews and it's doing really well on Netflix. Same thing with The Humans, which is now on Hulu, which is a straight play. It's doing really well on Showtime and Hulu. And I think that that's the nice thing about it. If you think about it in a weird way, cable and streaming services are like what theater is to film. It's a smaller group of people. They don't have to worry about making a lot of money off of it. It caters to that smaller, more sophisticated crowd. And I actually think that if there's a bright light in the future, it is probably that streaming services and cable services, and look, I think they took the Sparks brothers and they did a musical called Annette with Adam Driver and Marie Cotillard. So I think that they are playing an important part in finding that middle ground, which seems to be TV, weirdly enough, for plays, both live productions that you liked or just small, like an art house, showing you those works that only have a limited appeal.
Well, what's the future of the Hollywood Broadway connection?
Well, it'll never end. That much we know. It. I mean, Broadway is older than Hollywood, and Hollywood has been borrowing from Broadway since Hollywood's inception and taking its talent from Broadway. And Broadway has always looked at what's successful in Hollywood and found some way of reinterpreting through theater. So I think it will always continue to be that way. I sincerely hope that there is a future for non-Hollywood movies to be made into musicals. Right now, it seems like only the stuff coming from England, which is developed maybe from the West End or the Fringe, seems to be the only competitor in musical theater these days. But I'm hoping as more and more people go into the field of musical theater, we will hopefully break out of it one day. But I'm not optimistic it's anytime soon. And I think Hollywood will always, when Oscar time comes, it knows that, for if they want to make a critically acclaimed Hollywood movie where actors will willing to work for scale, they'll keep on making it. Look, last year, Anthony Hopkins, who would have thought, he won the Best Actor for The Father, which was based on a British play. So I think that there'll always be, this thing will continue on. I just really hope that young people, as they get older, will come to love theater as much as us aging folks do.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. Until next week, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Thanks for listening.